Well, welcome everyone. Again, this is Melinda Gertz with DAC Patient Recruitment Services. I want to thank you all today for joining us. Today's webinar topic is Turning Around Your Slow-Enrolling Trial. With us today, I have two of my esteemed colleagues, Dan McDonald and Scott Schreiber. Before I go into introducing them, I would like just to let you know about some of the features for the webinar. For the question and answer session, we will be using the chat feature. So on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, you'll see there's a chat question there. I would please encourage you that throughout the presentation, should you have any questions, if you would just send those to me. I will be collecting all of the questions, and at the end of the presentation, we'll have some time set aside for Q&A and be able to have Scott and Dan address those questions for you. Also, just a couple of other housekeeping issues. Please make sure that if your line is unmuted, that you please mute it for us so we can try to minimize or eliminate background noise and hear what Scott and Dan have to share with us today. And lastly, at the end of the webinar, when you close out of this session, you will be sent a quick survey. Just would like for you to take a few minutes to provide your direct feedback to us in terms of the webinar, the content that was presented, and share any other topics that might be of interest for future webinars. I would also like to take a moment to introduce Scott Schreiber. Scott is the Executive Vice President and General Manager for Therum. He has over 20 years of experience in the pharmaceutical and device industry. He has a strong background in CNS development, but he's also worked extensively in other areas such as oncology, hematology, pain, cardiovascular, renal, anti-infective, and respiratory. And before I turn it over to Scott to take us into setting the stage and talking about the things that we need to think about when we're dealing with a challenging enrollment for a study, I want to take a minute to ask a quick polling question of the audience. So I'm going to open the polling here. The question is, do you have a trial that's currently facing a delay of greater than 1 month due to enrollment issues? So I'm going to give you just a few moments to answer the poll, and we'll close the poll. All right, it looks like we have the majority in. So what we can tell from the feedback here, 72% said yes, that you have a trial that's currently facing a delay greater than 1 month, and 25% of you said no, and then we just had a small percentage that said I'm too afraid to say, at the 3%. So with that, Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you all for joining today, and thank you, DAC, for inviting me to participate in this webinar. What I'd like to do is start off with a polling question, because I'd like to understand who the audience is, because I think it'd be nice to know who we have on the call. It might change some of the ways that we present the rest of the slides. So, Melinda, can we do the next one?
Absolutely. We'll start right now. So the next polling question is, please let us know which of the industry segments listed below best fit your company profile. So let's give you a minute to answer those for us, please. Okay, it looks like everybody's pretty much finished, so I'm going to go ahead and close the polling. And what the results are is about 16%, Scott, are with a large biopharmaceutical company. 19% are with a mid-sized to small biopharmaceutical company. 38% are with a CRO, and 27% did not fit into any of the categories. And there is no one on the line that is representing a medical device company.
Okay, great. Thank you, Melinda. Let's go to the next slide. my role here is to really present some of the facts around enrollment, and I think it's kind of difficult to put all of this into 5 or 6 slides. As I was putting this together a few weeks ago, I thought, well, this will be easy. All I have to do is put together a few slides, but it's challenging to fit all that you want to say in a couple of slides. So I think everyone's aware that enrollment is an issue, and that's why we're all on the call. It's something that impacts the industry not only in direct fixed costs, but also in opportunity costs. And those are, you really can't put a figure on that. Every day that's lost, depending on the type of compound that's being developed, can cost tens of thousands to potentially millions of dollars. A lot of you are familiar with the Tufts Center for Study of Drug Development. I've worked with them on a couple of things over the years myself, and they did a report back about 2 years ago now. They may have updated it, and I apologize if there's newer numbers, but I think this is interesting. In their analysis of about 150 trials and 16,000 patients, they found that 9 out of 10 studies actually did achieve enrollment goals, but that it can take up to double the original time frame to complete those trials. And then these were, by the way, global or worldwide trials. 11% of the sites that they looked at failed to enroll a single patient. And I would venture to guess that depending on the indication and therapeutic area you're looking at, that number would even be higher in a number of different cases. 37% under-enroll. So if you look at those two numbers together, you have close to 50% of the sites in these trials don't achieve enrollment targets. 39% do meet their enrollment targets, and 13% exceed. So you have another 50+% that are doing what you want them to do, and that's pretty telling. And 95% of all these trial delays are due to the slow patient enrollment. So I'd like to do another quick polling. You can tell that I like doing the polling. I'd like to understand from the people on the call how frequently you encounter these types of delays. So Melinda, if you could pull up the next polling.
Will do. Just started. So we'll give everybody a few minutes to respond. The question is, how frequently do you encounter enrollment delays? Is it for every study, for most studies, for some studies, seldom, or never? All right, we're going to stop the polling. Looks like most people have finished. And Scott, it looks like that the majority fall either into for most studies or for some studies. The majority of the respondents have responded that way.
Thank you, Melinda, and that's exactly what we expected. And that's again the reason that we're talking about this now. These delays are impacting everyone, no matter what the indication and no matter what the region. And this next slide goes through enrollment delays by region, and as you can see, just about every region. We don't have Asia Pacific represented here, but they tend to do actually a little bit better job than even Latin America or Europe. But in almost every region, you see enrollment delays of at least a month or more. As I started thinking about the way that enrollment has been dealt with over the 3 decades that I've been working in this business, and how patient recruitment in particular has been handled, I kind of put it into just a short timeline. And in the 90s, really, clinical trials had been ongoing for many years before that, but really in the 90s, I think, with the advent of direct-to-consumer advertising and being able to recruit for patients using more mediums than were available in the past, you saw patient recruitment being done mainly by that radio, TV, and newspaper ads, and patient recruitment was done for those harder to find patients, or if there were large, phase 3, phase 4 trials, you saw advertising for those larger programs. Then in the 2000s, with the internet and the ability to do data mining, it became a more focused effort. You could do links to pharmacy data and really be able to target populations and target not only the advertising but also letters to patients through different mediums. In the last 4 or 5 years, I think what we've seen is more of a focus on social media, targeted training, not only of sites but also of the patient population, utilization of patient advocacy groups, and a whole myriad of other techniques to really enhance the patient recruitment. And as we all know, and this is a slide that you'll see later on in Dan's presentation, there are a number of reasons for these enrollment challenges. The protocol criteria, I think some people would argue that we sometimes are too restrictive in protocols, but there are reasons for needing to do that, especially in earlier phase trials. It's difficult to identify patients. There's a whole bunch of reasons why patients want to participate in trials. You need to figure out what those things are. Screen failures flag a number of different indications. Consents can be challenging with these patient populations. Competing studies, obviously, as time has gone on, there are a lot more trials ongoing than ever before, and it makes it very challenging to find patients. Site fatigue, I think, is something that we don't talk about enough. The longer a trial goes on, the harder it is to keep the attention of the sites. And the fairness of grants, investigator grants. So, I think we need to make sure that investigators are being paid for what they do, but it can't be too extreme. So I think we're going to do one more quick poll, and we'd like to know from these challenges that we presented, what do you see as the biggest challenges for your trials? Melinda, if we can pull up the next one.
Absolutely. So just to start the polling, as Scott mentioned, the question is, what is the biggest factor impacting enrollment in your trials? So is it protocol criteria? Is it the site issues? There's a number of things listed there. Is it identifying qualified patients, consent issues, or competing studies? So I'll give you a few moments to respond to the poll. All right, looks like the majority of the people have cast their votes, and it looks like Scott, that it's close. Identifying qualified patients and screen failures takes first place as the biggest factor that impacts enrollment in their trials, followed not too far behind with protocol criteria.
And those jive very well with other data that I've read and seen too. So thank you all for taking that last poll. You can tell if I was a teacher, I'd love to have one of those clicker systems in my classroom. I like being able to get instant feedback. So I'm going to wrap up and turn this over to Dan in a second. But one of the things that we didn't want to spend a lot of time harping on being proactive versus reactive, but certainly I think we're seeing over the last several years that more and more CROs and sponsors are engaging patient recruitment firms and patient recruitment techniques much earlier on in the process, so that they can ensure that they have a good handle on what's going on with the patient population. It may seem, based on historical data, looking at clinicaltrials.gov and Citeline and other databases, that it may be easy to enroll into a certain study, but patient recruitment techniques and engaging early on is becoming the norm. It's not just for special populations, rare diseases anymore, and it can certainly save you a lot of time in the long run, and that's something that Dan will talk about. But what we're here to talk about today is, if you get into a situation where you do have a slow enrolling trial, what can you do? Who should you engage? Making sure that you use a vendor that has an established track record, that they have experience in the particular indication and patient population you're looking at, understanding their strengths and ensuring they're a good fit for what you need. And don't wait too long to ask. I think we all think, well, next month it's going to happen and we're going to get through this. It doesn't hurt to explore options and figure out what the best path is, and it may be just a backup plan, but it's always good to have something in your back pocket. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and he can take it from there.
Terrific. Thank you, Scott. I'm just going to ask Scott and Melinda if everybody can hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you, Dan.
Great. I want to make sure we're not having a technical issue. Well, thanks, Scott, for doing a tremendous job of laying the groundwork for us and how companies find themselves in this predicament. The good news, I think, which is becoming clear, is that you're not alone, though I doubt that's particularly comforting. Now we're going to spend some time talking about the different ways that you can sort of dig yourself out of this situation. And what I plan to share with you today are some down-to-earth, rational approaches that you can take to get your hands around the problem and then walk you through some potential pathways for improving enrollment and ultimately writing your course. Let me be clear, though, there's certainly no silver bullet, and the potential solutions that I'm going to present are, somewhat generic. They're not specific to a particular type of trial. As you know, every trial is different, and the challenge is causing slow enrollment change. Nonetheless, I think if we can share some ideas and approaches that you can take back to your desk to help you turn enrollment in a more positive direction, then we think we've delivered some value here today, and that's really our goal. So the first step to fixing a problem is certainly admitting that you have one, and that's kind of the old 12 steps approach. Don't panic. Take a deep breath and figure out the situation and then start to plan. The good news is if you're managing the project, the chances are that you're going to be the first to know that something's amiss, even before others up the ladder do, and folks in management maybe come and knock on your door about it. So now is your chance to really start putting together some ideas to be considered for when you finally do sit down, with the powers that be and present your plan. And the earlier that you can get started on this process, as soon as you realize that something is not right, the better off that you're going to be. Ultimately, the better outcomes you're going to get and the more money you're going to save. So that was the first step. Second step is really needing to understand your situation and dig your hands in and diagnose the issues, which really starts with looking at the metrics. Understand what you're facing in terms of enrollment. How many patients do I have left to enroll? Understand how much time you have left to get there. As we talk through the different potential solutions, timing is going to be play a very big role in sort of determining what solutions really will fit your plan and which won't. Obviously, you're in a situation that's very urgent, and the time involved with implementing certain strategies and tactics is going to impact whether you're successful or not. So understanding how much time you have left is really critical. Next, determine the enrollment rate at your site. So both on average over the course of the entire enrollment period and then more recently. So, for example, maybe over the past 3 months. The most recent performance at the sites is probably indicative of what you're going to see from those same sites going forward, or possibly something worse than that. Give the enrollment rate and the number of sites you have. When you're developing your forecast, take the enrollment rate and the number of sites you have, do the math, and figure out if you continue with the same number of sites at the same enrollment rate, how long is it going to take for you to hit your target? So this is really now your real, true enrollment end date. To pretend it's something different than that is just silly. So unless you're acting very early when there are only some signs of erosion, most likely your date has been pushed out already. Even if all your sites started performing better, and they rarely do, you're not going to end up where you originally planned. So here's what I typically like to do, and this is what we recommend to many of our clients, is take a closer look at your sites and then create a pie chart of sorts. Drop each of the types of sites into the different slices of the pie or bucket. So you're going to have a poor performer bucket, and you're going to have right through to your top performers. Now carve out the top 50%. Those that fall into the better and best categories are the ones you really want to focus on. You want to keep your attention focused on those that are performing. You want to keep them motivated, and you want to figure out what you need to do to help them continue to perform at a high level. Then you need to supplement their efforts as much as possible. Worst case scenario, you can go beyond the 50% back into sort of the fair performer category to help backfill enrollment. But you really want to focus on those sites that are going to give you the best possible chance for success. And those are the sites that have the capability to perform, not the sites that you'd be wasting time with if you give too much attention, to try to rescue. So Scott walked through some of these already earlier in the presentation, but it's important to understand really what the problems are. And there are some that can be solved through, a rejuvenated site support and patient recruitment effort, and there are some that certainly cannot. Now, you're still sort of in information gathering mode at this point so that you can properly diagnose the situation and determine the best path forward. One of the things that you should do early on is ask all of the current study stakeholders. So, ask your sites, ask your monitors, ask your project managers, your fellow clinical operations personnel. These are the people that are closest to the issue and will be your fastest route to helping to diagnose the problems that you're facing. Then what we typically recommend you do is you chart and compare the responses from each of these different stakeholder groups, and you look for commonalities, and then kind of begin building your plan outward to address those. Now, for certain common issues like protocol criteria or the fairness and the competitiveness of the grant that you're paying to your sites, you may ultimately need to bring in other members of the management team to determine the best path forward. But for many of the issues, there are actually things that you can do right now to start changing the course and righting the ship. So let's spend some time now talking through some of the common approaches we will take with sponsors when we work with them to help right the course and turn around slow-enrolling trials. This is certainly not a comprehensive set of solutions, but just some of the approaches we use sometimes that, while simple in nature, can drive very positive results. We've really learned over time that it doesn't have to be a super expensive, robust, and glitzy campaign in order for it to work. We set this up in kind of a pros and cons fashion so that you can appreciate the potential benefits of each solution, but also understand the risks and the drawbacks. And then I've tried to reference time and cost factors associated with each of these as much as possible to help you draw some comparisons and make choices that best fit your study. So one of the first things that most sponsors and CROs consider when things start to go poorly is to add new sites. And this is an approach that's been around forever and, with good reason. The logic is typically something along the lines of, our existing sites started off enrolling strong and have trailed off in recent months, stating that they have exhausted their patient pool, and now it has become increasingly difficult to identify qualified patients. And we know from, some of the polls that were conducted earlier in the presentation that identifying patients is one of the number one challenges that most of you are facing. So thus, the logic goes, if we find new sites, then we will again be starting fresh and we can enroll well across those new sites until maybe the same problem occurs and they've exhausted the patient pool again. It's kind of like that scene in Jaws where Brody sees the shark and says something to the effect of, we're going to need a bigger boat. In this case, I think the saying goes, we're going to need more sites. But bringing on new sites, while it may solve the problem, it also might mask the larger issue that you're facing. So here's just a few pros and cons related to this particular approach. Pros would be that you get a fresh, pool of patients, and we talked about that. Certainly new sites are typically more enthusiastic. The good news is now that you're already into the study, you do have some benchmark enrollment data to compare against. You can take the performance of your best sites as your benchmark data, and then look for sites that appear to have the capability to match that enrollment rate. And this is a strategy that's appropriate for most study types. It's fairly ubiquitous in terms of its ability to be effective. Some of the cons associated with this particular approach would be that it's time-consuming. When you think about the number one delay factor currently facing clinical trials, I think Scott referenced the Tufts Center earlier. They've done a study that shows that contracting with investigative sites is the number one cause of study delay today. So you really need to take into account how much time it's going to take to get these sites on board. It's a costly endeavor. You've got site grants, you've got monitoring costs that will increase, you've got CRO management fees that will increase, and so there are some significant costs involved. It certainly may not solve the root problems of slow enrollment, what's really driving down enrollment, and you may end up in the same situation in a few months. Last but not least, if you're conducting an international study, in some countries you actually need to get regulatory approval ahead of being able to add new sites. So those are all things you need to take into account when looking at that potential solution. So as we move on in terms of looking at the portfolio of solutions available, earlier we talked about getting feedback from the various stakeholders. This is actually not just part of the diagnosis, but ultimately can be part of the solution. Time and again in our interviews and surveys and discussions with sites, they express to us that one of the biggest frustrations is not being included in the planning, not being asked for their inputs, and then also poor communication along the way. It's our belief that we really need to provide sites with a voice, and we found over time that CRCs at the sites, study coordinators at the sites, are their own best advocates. Sometimes the sites are fatigued with the study and the challenges that it presents. When they run out of steam, they will often begin, focusing their attention on other studies that are more exciting or easier to enroll. So really the goal here is to recapture their attention and make sure that they know that we hear them, that we understand their frustrations, that we're bringing the cavalry, and that we're going to support them and that they're not alone in the fight. So there are a few different ways that you can do this, which often can be part of a larger sort of site rejuvenation effort. One of the easiest and cheapest approaches is through the conduct of a web-based survey, what we like to call a site needs assessment here at DAC. It's different from the questions asked during a site feasibility analysis, where this survey is 100% focused on patient recruitment. And the questions are meant to collect feedback on not only the challenges that the sites are facing, but also to learn about, best practices. What initiatives have sites used that are working well? What hasn't worked? Why are the best sites performing well? And last, but certainly, very important, what support do the sites need to help them perform better going forward? Next, you can consider engaging each site directly. On bigger studies, you might need to do something like a webinar, but certainly ideally, if you can have either face-to-face conversations with site personnel and visit those sites, or if nothing else, do a video conference. Giving that site a chance to sort of talk to you in person demonstrates how much you care. You're also going to get very unique insights into some of the issues that site is facing and help to start working through their problems. Last but not least, look at creation of a CRC advisory committee where the study coordinators can gather virtually, let's say through a regular web conference, maybe a monthly or every 6 weeks a web conference, but on a regular basis to discuss challenges together, talk about some of the best practices, the things that they're doing that are working well, talk about some of the recruitment and retention focused feedback that they want to share with the sponsor, and really give them a chance to speak with each other, understand that they're not alone, understand that there are ways to be effective, and that some of their colleagues at other sites are doing that and are being effective. It's one of the best ways we found for sites to really stay motivated, communicate well, and learn new ideas for enrollment. And this is something we strongly believe in, and it has produced good results for us in the past. So just going through real quickly the pros and cons. the training will demonstrate, I'm sorry, I think I jumped ahead a slide here. Okay, sorry about that. So the pros here are that it's quick and easy to implement. There's a low cost involved. It recognizes sites as a critical stakeholder. It's also going to reveal obstacles that only the sites may see. It's going to capture best practices. And it's also going to drive adoption rates. We found that if you ask sites for their opinions and then later on you implement recruitment strategies, you're going to see a much higher adoption rate of those recruitment strategies if they have direct buy-in on the path forward. What are the cons associated with this initiative? Well, it certainly adds more work for sites. It may establish false expectations. Obviously, if you're getting their feedback and they're giving you guidance on what to do, you can't always do everything that they're suggesting. So it's really important that you manage those expectations properly. And if you don't manage these sessions properly, it can certainly turn into a complaint session, and that's something that you have to really work through. One of the tips that we would offer is to provide a small gift card, maybe a Starbucks gift card, to each coordinator that participates in the survey. This is one of the ways that you can drive participation, and it's also a nice way to give back to the sites. So moving forward, outside of getting the site's direct inputs, one of the areas that we see that has a positive impact on slow-enrolling trials is through an interim site training and rejuvenation meeting. Ideally, this is something that you will do in person, but we understand that given the nature of today's trials, which are often taking place in a multinational setting, this is not always a viable option. So instead, scheduling a series of live training webinars is a great path forward. It's a very cheap and easy way to set up these interactions with the sites, and it's also a terrific way to engage sites across the globe. A training program will arm sites with knowledge which can immediately be put to use on your study. The content for the program can be directly created from the Site Needs Assessment survey that we just talked about on the previous slide. So you can funnel the challenges and the potential solutions into the training, and it's a terrific way for sites to see that they're not alone, that there are solutions that other sites are using, which are driving positive results. Typical programs would include a review of patient recruitment fundamentals, enrollment challenges with the discussion of potential solutions, sometimes roundtable discussions where sites can share best practices, and so on. This is also a chance for you to communicate what you are doing as a sponsor to support enrollment going forward and address their challenges. Rolling out your recruitment plan now is really a terrific way to get sites excited and let them know that they're going to be receiving support and that you're directly invested in having them be successful.
Obviously, don't use it.
So, what are some of the pros and cons associated with this? Well,
the red dot.
Pros, it demonstrates the sponsor's interest in the site's success. So you're basically saying to the sites directly, we hear you, we understand that you need support, and this is one of the things we're doing to support you. Of course, it's going to introduce new skills and best practices that the sites can take back and begin implementing right away. There's a relatively low cost in doing this, and these web conferences are quick and easy to implement and set up. So it's a simple yet effective approach to really improve enrollment.
That's all you want? Is that the slide, right? Okay.
Just as a reminder, if you're not... Oh, sorry, Dan, I was just going to say, as we're recording the webinar, just as a reminder, if you're not presenting, will you please mute your line?
Thank you. And just real quickly, in terms of the cons associated with a training approach, it's certainly going to require time that CRCs typically don't have. There's time involved, of course, in developing the content, conducting the survey, putting the content together, putting the slides together, and executing the webinar. And it's certainly not a standalone solution, but it can absolutely drive positive results. One of the things that you can do as a tip would be to use an accredited training service provider and offer the certified clinical research coordinators and certified CRAs continuing education credits as part of their participation in the training program. And that's going to help drive interest and enthusiasm and participation. So these are just some some metrics we wanted to share with regards to the impact that a training program can have on a slow-enrolling trial. And this is just, one particular example, but this is a webinar that took place where we stepped in at a midway point where the trial wasn't enrolling well. And, I'm not going to walk through all the numbers, but you can see the impact that we saw with regards to the number of, pre-screened, the number of consented, and the number of randomized patients directly following the implementation of the webinar. The next slide is really just a look at the impact of training from another perspective, and this is really where we implemented a training program proactively at the very beginning of the recruitment program, at the very beginning of the study. And you can see very clearly on this impact graph the impact that training had on performance. And the other thing it does is, of course, it gets sites thinking in a patient recruitment and retention mindset very early on. If you do training at a investigator meeting right at the beginning, it also gives the sites a chance to understand the support that you'll be providing and give crucial buy-in, to the program. And as I mentioned earlier, getting their buy-in and feedback is very important in terms of having good adoption rates of the strategies that you roll out later on as part of your recruitment program. For many chronic broad-based types of conditions or those that involve a high sort of advocacy type of patient community, the use of a direct-to-patient initiative can be effective, things like direct-to-patient broadcasting and print advertising. These are very hard-hitting approaches, and they can be fast-acting approaches once the campaign is actually launched. When you think about the new technologies and market data that are available now, which allow these programs to be much more targeted and more cost-effective than ever before, there are greater benefits. Companies are leveraging Nielsen market data. They're leveraging things like insurance claims data, more and more electronic medical records to really understand, where these advertising dollars can be spent the most effectively in the right geographies aimed at the right individuals to get them to take action and hopefully result in less waste and lower cost. If you have enough time to put this type of initiative in place and get the budget dollars, this should be a very real consideration as part of your plan. Now, what are some of the pros and cons associated with this? Well, pros, like as I mentioned, once initiated, you can reach a large audience very quickly and start driving responses. You can geo-target these campaigns now within the geographies directly around the research site. So you're only really reaching people that have a higher likelihood of being able to commute to the study site and participate in the study. You can leverage geographic and market data, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago. Typically, it's more appropriate for broader, based, highly prevalent conditions. And the other good thing about this, it's fairly easy to track performance. There's great metrics associated with these campaigns. Typically, once you launch them, you very quickly start to see the results and the inbound calls and activities associated with it. From a cons perspective, there's a long ramp-up time, right? You're going to have to get IRB approval because this is a patient-facing initiative. So that's going to take you a significant amount of time to get the content for the advertisements created, get that in front of an IRB and get it approved, especially if you have to go through local IRBs. It's a high-cost initiative. Certainly the cost of doing direct-to-patient broadcast advertising is expensive. The response that you get from these campaigns can sometimes be overwhelming to sites. You really have to think about hiring a call center, which represents additional cost, and channeling these calls to a place where these patients can be pre-screened, and only pre-qualified patients would then be sent along to the study site. And as I mentioned, it may not be appropriate for kind of lower prevalence conditions or studies that require a confirmed diagnosis before a patient can be referred. So digital web-based approaches are really all the rave these days, and they should be. There's an ever-increasing pool of data around today's web user, and it's allowing advertisers to deliver highly targeted messages to the right user at the right time and in the right place to get them to take real action. Typically, this can be done at a lower cost than broadcast advertising, but we are seeing that gap kind of growing smaller and smaller as demand continues to grow. Companies are using everything from study-specific websites to online trial listings on any number of the trial listing services and registries. So the use of social media has gotten very big and social listening. The use of pay-per-click advertising, search engine optimization, display advertising, the list really goes on and on. There are a lot of potential pathways. And there's really no way that you can be an expert on all of them. But the good news, I think, here is that there are a lot of experts out there who you can hire to give you guidance. If you want to go it alone, though, it's really not that hard to leverage certain technologies, and the providers of those technologies and ad space can often help you determine the most effective way to maximize the return on your spend. So, for example, setting up Google AdWords or placing advertisements on Facebook is relatively easy, and it's relatively easy to geo-target those ads to the locations around your research site. So you can sort of launch ads quickly, see how they work, and sort of take a step-by-step approach that is fairly easy to implement, relatively low cost, and things you can kind of do on your own to try to get some traction. Last but not least, there's terrific metrics that you're going to be able to get through a digital advertising campaign, which will allow you to determine the effectiveness of your ads and then make course corrections should those ads not be working out for you. So Again, just to summarize the pros and cons, from a pros perspective, direct-to-patient digital marketing can be highly targeted. It's multi-directional, so you're not only just putting advertisements out there, you're actually getting feedback from patients. And then you can localize the campaigns very easily. It's relatively easy to implement. And a lot of the pricing around these initiatives is pay-for-performance pricing. So it's something where you're really not paying for what you're not getting. It will allow for pre-qualification of potential study subjects, so you can post ads online, then direct anybody that links through on these ads to a study-specific website in an online pre-screener to really pre-screen them ahead of time before you actually send the referral along to the study site. And last but not least, once initiated, it can generate results quickly. And as I mentioned, there's terrific metrics available on these types of campaigns. From a cons perspective, there's a long ramp-up time. It requires IRB approval, like other types of direct-to-patient advertising. It can be costly when there's a broad-based approach that's taken. Like broadcast advertising, the responses can be overwhelming to the sites if you're not pre-screening patients first. And it's less appropriate for certain types of patient demographics. So we're coming close to the end of our list of potential solutions, and then we'll get into a quick case study. So direct-to-physician and direct-to-medical community approaches are, I think, highly underrated. In a recent survey among potential referring physicians, 40% reported that they would be willing to refer patients for trial consideration if they were aware that the study was being conducted in their community or region. Also, findings from our site needs assessment at DAC have revealed that one of the top methods sites use to find patients for their oncology studies is through referrals from physicians in the local community. And the reason we mention oncology studies is because that's an indication where we often hear that physician referrals are not effective, and actually we see quite the opposite of that at DAC in the campaigns that we conduct. So we're talking through some of the steps now we've involved with developing a direct-to-physician campaign.
Oh, it appears that we may have lost Dan. Are the rest of you still with us?
Yep. Scott's here.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Well, I'll just pick up for Dan until he can rejoin us, so we'll check in and see what happened there. But, as Dan was talking about with the medical community outreach, and this is one of the areas where I think medical community outreach really has a place in your strategy. It really depends on, again, as he said, the therapeutic indication in which you want to utilize it. You definitely know, depending on the healthcare systems, especially within the states as it still currently exists, there might be some hesitancy from some specialists referring to other specialists, but you're starting to see that really open up in a broader spectrum. Also, when there's just more education and knowledge about the clinical trials that are taking place within their communities. So when we keep with the current pros and cons associated with using medical community outreach, obviously the pros, there's a short implementation timeline. I mean, it really is just the development of materials, which you can usually do pretty quickly. For the most part, it does not require IRB approval. There are some local IRBs that have really started asking for all materials to be reviewed and approved, but even if that's the case, they do it pretty expeditiously. Physician-referred patients obviously are more likely to qualify, and we would expect that. It's ideal for conditions requiring a confirmed diagnosis, especially if it might be something that someone may not be 100% sure if they've actually been diagnosed or not. Raises the profile of the sponsor from a broader medical community perspective. And you can even, like with your targeted advertising that Dan just discussed, you can geo-target it. Some of the cons associated with it, as we just mentioned, could be the fear of losing patients. Requires follow-up effort to optimize effectiveness. It can't just be an outreach with a physician letter or physician brochure. If you're going to implement a medical community outreach program and have it effective, you've got to make sure that you have the resources in place to really follow up to maximize the effectiveness. There may be some lead time for the generation of materials, so you'll want to take that into consideration. And then also just the time for the study coordinator and the principal and investigator to review the list. So probably related to that, your con is you just want to make sure that you build in enough time to have the materials developed, approved, and to have the list approved by the study coordinators and the PIs. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dan.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me okay now. Sorry that I got booted off the call. Just really one last point related to this slide would be the tip that appears here. Really one of the more targeted ways that you can conduct a medical community outreach campaign now in the U.S. would be to leverage insurance claims data, and increasingly electronic medical records are being made available for this purpose. But the idea would be essentially that you locate physicians that are practicing in the area directly around your research sites, and then validate that those physicians actually have the volume of patients by looking at their insurance claims activity. So sort of the old-fashioned way of doing this was to develop a list, working with the site, and then reaching out with materials, but not really being sure that those physicians around you actually are seeing the target patient. Now you can leverage things like insurance claims data to really try to validate the volume of patients and make sure that the physicians that you're reaching out to actually have the patients that you're looking for. That's one of the tips that we would share with you. So those are just some of the potential solutions that can be explored. One of the things, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because I know we're getting towards the end, but it's just understanding some of the cost factors behind a rescue approach. At this point, if you're still not convinced about the importance of developing a proactive recruitment plan, and engaging sites in that process, then perhaps some of these next slides will kind of finally hammer home that point. And I think the evidence is pretty compelling. When taking a proactive approach to recruitment, there are certain factors that you need to take under consideration in your planning. So first and foremost is actually setting aside budget dollars directly focused on patient recruitment, outside of the CRO budget, outside of the site budget. We know that the CRO is supposed to conduct a strong feasibility, right, and that the sites, have the patients, and that your enrollment projections for the study are really based on all that. But it doesn't matter with something like 90% of trials missing their enrollment deadlines. Are you really going to walk the same beaten path? I think the answer should be no. Earlier, we talked about some of the common contingencies to address slow enrollment, and here we just share with you some of the costs associated with each of those. Things like adding new sites. When you consider the fully loaded cost of this action, it's about $20,000 to $30,000 per site in the U.S. Amending your protocol. You may have to do this either way, but the costs associated with such an action are pretty staggering when you consider the reverberation kind of effect across many of the study stakeholders, the vendor contracts, the site contracts, IRB submissions, regulatory issues, all the things that come with a protocol amendment. And then you can extend the timeline of your study, of course, and that seems like an easy solution, but good luck pulling it off with your management team and your board. And there are significant direct out-of-pocket costs and opportunity costs associated with that. So you really have to understand the different impact from a cost perspective of the different solutions you're looking at. And this is just a quick kind of case study or rescue costing scenario. And this is for a phase 3 multiple sclerosis campaign that was targeted to enroll 1,000 patients across 100 sites in 12 months. The total anticipated cost for the clinical operations sort of study conduct aspect of this project was about $10 million. After the first 6 months had passed, enrollment was lagging, and a decision was made to add a centralized patient recruitment campaign. In order to get the program planned and rolled out, it would take about 2 to 3 months, and there were a variety of costs associated with this delay in getting this program underway, which would have added up to about $250,000 in cost. The actual centralized recruitment campaign itself was going to cost about $1 million. So the total impact was a budget increase of about 13%. Then if you look at sort of what the proactive approach would have been, you see something quite different. The cost of the campaign would have been about $500,000 versus the $1 million plus figure we just shared with you a minute ago. The savings come really in a variety of formats. Obviously, the need and the urgency alone will drive up the cost with your vendor or the vendors that you employ for this. It's a supply and demand issue. And there are certainly efficiencies that can be gained from including a recruitment plan as part of the normal study planning process. You can consolidate your IRB submissions, participation in the investigator meeting by a recruitment vendor, and conducting training with sites very early on will help them start with a recruitment mindset from the get-go. You can use lower-cost recruitment methods, which would work good in a proactive scenario but may not work later on, and we talked about some of those earlier today. So a proactive approach can save you a significant amount of money. This is just, and we're getting to the end here. I know we have just about another minute left. This just looks at a couple of other potential approaches you could have taken to the rescue situation. In this particular case, thinking about a protocol amendment would have run about $1 million. Also, the sponsor made the decision to replace about 30 of the sites with new sites. The site replacement cost was an estimated $900,000. So the total amended project cost was now $11.9 million, which represented a 19% budget increase. So when you really compare the proactive versus the rescue approach and the cost savings that are available, it's not even close. In this particular analysis, the cost savings with the proactive planning approach was 160% to 280%. So once you've determined what's wrong and you present your situation to management, you can always invite in the experts to figure out how to tackle the problem. This is something we'd definitely recommend that you do with your study. Most of the time you'll get some free advice, and you'll also get a sense for what it will cost to dig yourselves out. And then you just have to go to your boss and get the money. And of course, good luck with that. So with that, we'd like to close out the presentation. I know we're running right up to the 1:30 end time, but we'll keep it open for any questions you might have, and I'd certainly like to thank you on behalf of myself and Scott and Melinda. We very, very much appreciate your time. Apologies for the technical difficulties we experienced at the beginning, but we would like to turn it now over for questions. Melinda, I'll turn it over to you to guide the discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dan and Scott. I'm have just a couple of questions. Maybe we can just get to a few of them and follow up afterwards on the other ones that came through. So Dan, I think this question really is going to you, and that is, when utilizing social media advertising, how do you address potential difficulties with disgruntled patients who may take the opportunity to voice their discontentment?
Yeah, that's really a great question. I mean, certainly there are challenges that come with that. I think often what we look to do is not, we're not engaging patients in a social media platform often in a sort of a two-way dialogue. I mean, what I mean by that is posting things that would allow for a variety of responses to be taken to our post. Often what we're doing is leveraging some of the highly targeted advertising that's available through the social media platforms. So really what you're leveraging there is the social media platform. In this case, it might be, for example, Facebook or Twitter or Pandora. You're leveraging user inputs, meaning content those users might be putting onto a page about their condition, about the situation of their family member or what have you, that particular platform is picking up on, and then it's delivering ads very specific to that particular dialogue or interest level from those patients. So more often than not, we're not putting the information about studies into a situation where you can have patients really chiming in directly about not only just negative thoughts maybe about the study, but also you don't want a situation where people are talking about their experience with the trial. It could be patients who are actively in the study as study subjects. You don't want them talking about their experiences that they're having in the study and the impact of skewing data. So that's really the way that we leverage social media as a company, and I would certainly invite Melinda or Scott to add on to that if they have anything.
No, I don't, Dan. That's I would agree with everything that you said there. I had just one other question that popped up. Had another question that popped up that I wanted to just take a moment to make sure we addressed, and that was, how successful are you with getting pharmaceutical companies to approve the $5 Starbucks gift card or other initiatives for participating? I think, Dan, when you presented about the study, the CRC, sort of advisory committee, just how successful have you been in getting pharmaceutical companies to buy off on that?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. It really hasn't been an issue. I think that more often than not, they're willing to get behind that. The idea is to get you're not sort of incentivizing the CRCs with $5 gift cards to directly recruit patients. Get me 2 more patients and I'll give you $10 in gift cards. This is really an opportunity for you to encourage them to participate, for example, in the slide that I had presented, in a coordinator advisory committee where they would participate, let's say, in monthly calls to talk about recruitment efforts and feedback on recruitment challenges, or to get them to participate in a survey, for example. We found that when we use it for that particular purpose, sponsors typically don't have an issue with it. Certainly if you're using it to kind of act as an incentive to directly go and enroll patients and give it as a reward for enrolling patients, I think they'd probably look at it in a different light. But for the way that we use it, it's been widely accepted at this point.
Well, great. Well, because we're just a few minutes past our end time, there are a couple of other questions that did come in. I want to thank you all for sending us questions. I'm sorry that we have run out of time to address all of those. I'll be speaking with Dan and Scott on the questions you sent in and get answers, and we'll get that sent to you when we follow up with the recording of the presentation. So with that, again, I want to thank Scott and Dan very much for your presentation today. It was very informative, and I even had some key takeaways that I jotted down. So thank you very much for joining us all. And as I mentioned, please make sure that you just take a few minutes to fill out the questionnaire at the end of the webinar when you close out the program. Again, thank you for your time, and I hope you all enjoy your afternoon.